Great. So we're all here. As David mentioned, we will proceed with the first panel that will tackle right away the issue of disinformation in the Ukrainian presidential election and more importantly, foreign interference and foreign disinformation campaigns that targeted the Ukrainian election process. We will follow the Atlantic Council moderation style, so we will not have any opening statements. We'll jump right into questions, and then after one round of questions, I will open the floor for your questions to the panelists. I'm glad that we started quite on a positive note, saying that, on a rare occasion, we have good news from Ukraine, and the vigilance that David talked about, actually maximizing that vigilance works when it comes to responding to organized disinformation. So I'm going to introduce our guests on the panel. First, we have Tatyana Slipachuk, who is head of Central Election Commission in Ukraine. Then we have GalynaPetrenko, who is director at Detector Media. Kateryna Kruk, she's a communications specialist at StopFake, and she was a Disinfo analyst at Ukraine Election Task Force. Jakub Kalenský, senior fellow at Atlantic Council and a Disinfo lead on the task force. And Yevhen Fedchenko from StopFake. He's a co-founder of StopFake, but he was also helping us on the Ukrainian Election Task Force, leading the disinformation direction. So I'm going to start from probably a question to Tatyana Slipachuk about the election process. I know that we're here for disinformation, first and foremost, and I will have a second question regarding disinformation. But also, one of the surprising findings in this monitoring mission was the lesser level of cyber attacks on Ukrainian Election Commission, although there were still some. So I would like to ask you about the, first of all, cyber attacks on the Election Commission. What was different, and did you, had any surprises, personally or organizationally, regarding the cyber attacks?
Thank you very much, and probably first of all, I would like to thank to organizers for two things. The first one, definitely for the initiative, which is very important, and another one to be ready to take us on board. I mean, the CSC almost as the latest participant of this event. I really think that it makes sense, because without understanding how the electoral administration sees the situation, what actual challenges and what problems we do have during the elections, and what can be usefully taken from your experience and your analysis, is really the chance for us to improve the second part of this electoral year and to meet the parliamentary campaign. Regarding the cybersecurity, I will be very short. First of all, again, it's very important that basing on the initiative both of the parliament, the government of the Ukraine, and the great assistance from the part of our partners from different countries, US, Canada, France, Italy, we joined the efforts and we managed to almost change the technical framework of our electoral commission. It's really important because unfortunately the equipment which was used prior to this year was really old, and for us it was one of the tasks to try as quickly as possible to make the necessary changes and to have more updated hardware and software, which was done, and the process still is going on. I really do think that from that point of view, maybe one of the reasons why we really do not face some big problems with our electronic system was the equipment and the necessary training we received on this level. On the other hand, I don't know whether it's good news or bad news for all of us, but in fact there were not serious attacks. It's really the fact. They were not something extremely strong, extremely specific, sophisticated, something that it was like the phishing attacks. It was something that is maybe very common thing with each governmental establishment in each world when somebody is looking for something, nothing specific.
Well, in a quick follow-up question to you then about disinformation in general. I know that it is a new team on the Central Election Commission, right? But still, you actually probably the first team that were engaging a lot on the disinformation and tackling disinformation issues, since there were a lot of, let's just say, foreign misrepresentation of the democratic process of elections in Ukraine. So what exactly did you do, apart from organizing the whole process in one of the biggest democracies in Europe, but specifically targeting disinformation? How did you do it?
I will avail myself to be a little bit critical in this specific issue because, frankly speaking, CSC was almost alone in fighting with disinformation. And I really think that is a big mistake of both of civil society, of state government, even of our partners. Because, in fact, we really faced quite a serious and massive disinformational attack. And it was one of the most important things I really and dangerous specifically for these elections because we started with a very low level of trust. It is a historical thing. It's not something which happened yesterday. For years, we have a very low level of trust in electoral administration, into elections, in principle in the Ukraine. Frankly speaking, I can name maybe 2 or 3 NGOs who was quite active in supporting our statements when we face-to-face fight with the disinformation. But in principle, all the attacks, the main purpose of which was to legitimize the electoral process, to make clear that despite of any choice, it is null, it is void, because it is undemocratic, it is artificial, it is not in line with the standards. Mm-hmm. And I really have like the proposal not to do the same things for the second parliamentary campaign. I have very interesting things to tell you regarding the specific disinformation cases and to support the very good sentence which was raised that unfortunately many disinformation inputs were done through the Ukrainian politicians. And it was done in a very sophisticated way. They just followed time by time all the electoral process. And on each part of the electoral process, we faced the specific disinformation attacks. And what is more important, these attacks were very understandable for those who did it, because they are very experienced players in the electoral process. And they knew from their previous experience that it is false information, that it is disinformation, that it is harmful, but they did it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the observations in our report is how to, sometimes it's hard to separate foreign interference when it comes to disinformation attacks and how the same disinformation tactics that are used in foreign interference being copied.
Ask us. We shall make you and give you some tips how you can very easily find the features which can be the main like flags for you to understand whether it is outside or inside.
Well, but speaking of foreign interference, speaking of this terrific topic of trying to attack the legitimacy of Ukrainian elections, I want to cross to GalynaPetrenko. You did a lot of great work for us actually monitoring Russian state-controlled media on their messaging, and it has been a huge kind of source of disinformation when it comes to electoral process. And as I remember, one of the biggest narratives there has been and was to attack the legitimacy of Ukrainian election process. What was like, how was it different from the previous campaign? And did you see anything new in terms of new narratives what they use in attacking the legitimacy of elections, candidates, or the state in general?
Thank you, Maxim. Russia. We monitored Russian political talk shows on major Russian TV channels, and we understand and we know that Russian TV channels are full of disinformation against Ukraine, not only during the presidential campaign, but during at least last 5 years. On Russian TV channels, there are some constant messages like in Ukraine Nazism is flourishing, that we have some split in church issues and so on, but also during the campaign, of course, that was added messages about election. For you to understand, 3 main political talk shows on Russian TV produce more than 20 episodes per week, unique episodes per week. They are quite extensive, and in 60% of these episodes of these shows, Ukraine was mentioned, and it was mentioned in a negative context. And the most popular message about Ukraine was that Ukraine is under Western control, even that Thomas was obtained by the US for Ukraine. And the second most popular message was that Ukrainian election was rigged. So I may confirm Tatiana's messages, and I also can confirm that all these messages from Russian TV shows, they were spread also in some particular Ukrainian TV stations. I may name it 112, News 1 and Inter. They were very active in it. That's why sometimes it's difficult to say was it foreign interference or did it come from inside?
But for example, in one example, so we make it more illustrative. In one example, what kind of really fresh new narrative that you've seen? Because we've seen it before in terms of attacking the electoral process, in terms of attacking the democracy and legitimacy of the government in Ukraine. Was there anything new that was like, oh wow, that's something fresh? And
I must say it was connected with current events. For example, about martial law. These Russian political talk shows and some Ukrainian TV stations and internet media outlets, they stated that martial law was invented in order to postpone elections. Not because of Russian attack in Kerch Strait, but in order to postpone the electoral process.
I think it's a good crossover to Kateryna, because I know that you helped us, but also that's kind of your priority to look at the networks and disinformation dissemination networks, how they work, because it's important to pay attention to messaging, but it also more importantly to pay attention how it's spreading, how it's being amplified, because that's where the biggest effect comes, not people believing so much in the messaging rather than being confused by onslaught. So in terms of this electoral campaign, what did you see new in terms of networks, amplifying networks, including in the context that some social media platforms starting cracking down on, including Facebook, on some of those networks linked to Russia?
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much for introduction and for your question. First of all, we have to understand that in a way the disinformation campaign during the elections and right before the elections wasn't anything new. It wasn't a special operation. It was rather a coronation of everything that Russia has done for the last 5 years. And this is really very much important to understand in the context of how Russians were using their messages and their narratives, because in fact, it won't be a surprise why we don't see a plethora of new narratives just before the elections. We see rather repetition, and the only one which was added and which was very actively used during the electoral campaign, which was about delegitimization of the entire process, saying that it was a fraud and whatever the result will be, we shouldn't trust them. The very issue is that the Russians created an impression within Ukrainian society and in Ukrainians themselves. So whatever targeting campaign was used, it was already going into a very prepared grounds. And this is a very big problem, not for Ukrainian society, but also for other countries, showing that it's not enough to start monitoring elections 2 months before it. It's not enough to invest into the most modern, up-to-date cybersecurity software, to the critical into critical infrastructure and institutions. You have to monitor all the time what is going on in your country and all the inputs which are coming from the inside and from the outside. Because when you look at the entire campaign of what Russian media has been doing and what they have intensified and maximized in the last couple of months, it was against Ukrainian authorities whatsoever. Meaning that whoever would come, the new candidate, the new face, they would simply gather everything. And it was really very interesting to see how Russian media were reporting on Zelensky, because they, judging from the intensity of mentions of Poroshenko, Zelensky, Tymoshenko, it was a surprise for Russians that he decided to run. And only up to 2 weeks before the first round, they started giving him more and more mentions. And the disproportion was huge. It was like 20-something%, and almost 70% was given to Petro Poroshenko in the negative context. So this is the very interesting outtake. So Zelensky was a surprise for them, and they were in a way inventing the narratives of how to present him. And right after he won the elections and started giving statements which are quite critical towards Russia, Russian media started to change the perception on him as well. So they're also adjusting to the situation in Ukraine. But going back to networks and to the specific campaign, I would say that probably the only new thing for Ukraine in terms of the disinformation campaign was the intensity of usage of social networks, because we still see that the TV stations and TV played the predominant role. They gave the most of the support for the running candidates or the negativity of the messages, but we see that Ukrainian politicians starting to use social media in a more smart way. They start working mostly with the targeting, and we're still actually analyzing what happened in the presidential elections, and so far there was only an analysis on the Zelensky campaign, and what we can see that on Facebook, I mean, the playbook which was used in the US and in the other countries as well, which is already very well analyzed, it was very precise targeting, targeting the groups, targeting the messages, and we also see that the main problem which arises is actually groups, networks, and the messages which are shared within groups, not that much into the newsfeed and not that much into the sharing the fake news and information. And another thing is Instagram. This is something very new for Ukraine. And to be honest, it's really very hard to decide whether it will turn into the next big thing in the political landscape in Ukraine. So far, Zelensky is the president, but still, he is the most popular, influential, and blogger in Ukraine among everyone, even among the celebrities. I think that the latest number that he has is a little bit more than 5 million followers, which is a huge number for Ukraine. The only question which still remains is whether those who are following him, they're active political supporters of his, because when you analyze his account, you also see there are a lot of followers from the former Soviet countries, and the messages he is also using on his Instagram, they aren't that much political. Before, it was mostly about his program, him being an actor, him being a comic, and still he uses after the elections, he still uses Instagram, but it's not his main platform. We see that he actually turned to Facebook, which is the main political platform in Ukraine for the political messaging. But it is a question of how Instagram will be used in the political campaigns in future, because this is definitely a next big step, a next big thing, because it is getting more and more popular in Ukraine. It's growing much faster than Facebook.
not only Instagram, but also messaging platforms
And
like
YouTube.
Telegram and WhatsApp. And since Atlantic Council works a lot with social media companies, especially when it comes to other electoral processes in U.S. as well, for example, closing a network, recent closure network of Russian bots on Facebook was partially thanks to the work of DFR Lab and other Atlantic Council process, but there is definitely not enough presence of social media platforms when it comes to tackling disinformation in the region, and not enough direct communication between companies like Facebook
And also regarding social media in general, and this is the lesson not only for Ukraine, but not lesson, rather a challenge, is how we place social media and internet in general into the electoral code. Because it feels like this is the Wild West where laws don't apply and where actually no one is following the regulations, not only in Ukraine, but also in Western countries. So this is a very big question,
There
first
are
of
no
all, first of all for social media, for big platforms, but also for the watchdogs, for the civil society, and also for politicians who are actually the ones,
legislators.
yes, abusing the law on how we, maybe not even to regulate, but how we bring social networks and big platforms in line with the existing legislator.
I want to turn to Jakub. Since Jakub has this extensive experience of tackling disinformation on pan-European level, being a lead at the European Commission on that for years. Now, when you compare the issues that you dealt on pan-European level of foreign interference with European EU democracies, comparing to this electoral process, what stands out for you in the intensity of campaigns, or something different, something that other European countries can learn from this campaign?
I think the biggest difference of this campaign, I have this little thingy here, thank you. I think the biggest difference actually was that here the disinformation campaign truly focused mostly on delegitimizing the whole process, whereas what we have seen during the Brexit referendum, during the French elections, German elections, Austrian elections, the Kremlin always had a very clear favorite whom they tried to support. It seemed to me that maybe here in Ukraine they weren't that sure, or maybe they thought that those candidates that they support, they have no chance. So it seemed to me that here the campaign really focused rather on delegitimizing the whole process and making Ukrainians feel as there is actually no point in going into elections, and it's not you who decide what the fate of the country will be, it's some outside forces, etc. Maybe let me just briefly describe how we worked, so that I would actually outline how we try to monitor the foreign interference. It all started with the monitoring of the Russian TV shows that we had from Detector media, and that's why we actually wanted to trace how the Russian narratives travel into the information space that might influence the Ukrainian elections, which is where StopFake and Roman Shutov were helping us really a lot. And we could clearly identify that those narratives that started on Russian TV would then travel into the online world. It was truly those narratives about elections will be rigged, they will be illegitimate because Ukrainians shut down the polling stations in Russia. The message that started in December, I believe, and it was parroted by Russian media, despite the fact that Ukrainians actually had quite a good reason to do that, because they couldn't guarantee the safety of the voters in Russia. And you would then see it repeated by Medvedev himself. Was it February or March? After a few weeks of this disinformation campaign. And this is a pattern you would see in Russian media so often. You let the state-controlled media repeat the disinformation, and then the official can come and say, as we already know from numerous reporting, this is the fact that ISIS fighters are joining the Ukrainian army, which is something that started on Ukrainian blog sites, and later it got repeated by Kiselyov and later by Russian politicians. So this was the pattern, and as I said, I think the biggest difference was that they really weren't that much focusing on pushing their own candidate. It was obvious which candidates are their favorite, but you wouldn't see it that much translated into the disinformation messaging. I think they knew that their candidates don't have a chance. If there was one candidate that was probably more attacked than any other, it was probably Petro Poroshenko. That's true. Yeah.
And I'll cross to Yevhen Fedchenko. I think that to be critical of this approach because it's very easy to, it's very hard to establish the border where foreign interference goes into, for example, local media or foreign media, because some of the views that are expressed by, for example, by a state-controlled, Russian state-controlled, may align logically or factually with reality on the ground. So I know that you always say that disinformation, the goal of disinformation not to convince, but to create confusion. But when it comes to media outlets, and since you're mapping the travel paths of those disinformation, in terms of media outlets, where do you think the biggest probably institutional weakness, where we sometimes cannot filter it out for ourselves and to so it's not so it doesn't slip into witch hunt of just critical opinions?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for inviting StopFake to be a part of this great project. It's really a great honor to contribute to it. And yeah, you're right, the whole process was about confusion. Because when we are saying if there was there was a meddling in the elections or there wasn't, usually we mean if some foreign agent, state or non-state supported that or another candidate. So that was definitely not the case, because they had preferences for some candidates, especially in the first round, but the tactic was to bring as much confusion as possible into the minds of voters, and to make sure that the choice would be very uneasy to do, and then the choice would be delegitimized, as it was said already, through presenting these elections as completely rigged. And also mockery was a big part of this delegitimization and disinformation, because when we watched Russian TV shows, they all were trying to mock Ukrainian democratic process, presenting that Ukraine is not really a state, what kind of elections we would expect from them. They don't have institutions, they don't have a democratic tradition. And the second point was that it was all about geopolitical choice. So it was not about particular candidate, but if Ukraine still belongs to the Russian-led sphere of influence, or Ukraine goes west and turns democratic. So that was another big debate. And as it was already said, it was very difficult sometimes to say which media outlets are leading the process and disseminating fake narratives. Is it Ukrainian media or Russian media, and actually who is taken from
or
from
is
where?
it intentional?
Or is it intentional? And so the main point was to look from where those narratives are coming. So StopFake was following them for the last 5 years, and all those narratives were already mentioned. So Ukraine as a failed state, Ukraine as a fascist state, Ukrainian weak or non-existent Ukrainian institutions, growing level of corruption and other things. So it was very easy to introduce them to Ukrainian media and then have them domesticated. And that was again the point of confusion for people, because when we are saying those narratives are coming from Russian media, and that is exactly the moment when people stop trusting it, because we already have grown kind of a resilience that if something is coming from Russian media, you should better not trust it. But if the same talking points are coming from Ukrainian media, that immediately change the situation, because media in Ukraine are among the most trusted institutions, and that play actually against democracy itself. So if we have a very democratic and very diverse media system, which brings very, very different messages to the audiences, including those messages picked up from Russian media. And it was already said, very nicely manipulated by Ukrainian domestic political agents. So people then become confused if they should trust it, if they should believe what they hear. And actually, this is the biggest moment, what you mentioned, how we can build resilience based on that premises, that it's coming from domestic, completely legit agents.
Yeah, the only difference, I think, we should differentiate not all Russian media, since there are independent Russian media. And France, at independent Russian media, told me that they haven't seen ever such a enthusiasm among their audience, Russian audience, towards the Ukrainian electoral process, and they couldn't ever imagine to have live stream of Ukrainian presidential debates translated to Russian and being so much, attracting millions of views. So that's, something surprising for the Kremlin as well, probably. I'm going to open the floor for questions. I think we just go by raising hand. If you have any questions, please. Yes, and who's handling the mic?
Before we find a mic, I will follow with the joke. Actually, you very rightly mentioned that there was such an intensity of reporting about Ukrainian elections on Russian TV. I think that at some point between the elections, between the first and the second round of elections, almost 60% of all news reports on Russian state-owned television was about Ukrainian elections. And there was a joke. Some man from Russia wrote on Facebook, and it was print screen and then shared on Twitter, that every single day he switches on TV. In the morning there is something on Ukrainian elections. In the afternoon there is something on Ukrainian elections. In the evening as well. And he said, "I'm now worried that on Sunday I will wake up and I will go to the election point to vote, because there is so much about elections that people they're simply lost, whether it's in Russia or in Ukraine."
So thank you, Maxim, and thank you for this panel. I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm at the Brookings Institution. I wanted to pose a question to all of you, whoever wants to take it, about the evolution of disinformation campaigns and tactics. All of you have hinted at this, but I'm really curious to hear a little bit more. One, about detection, because obviously social media companies have been taking down various accounts. They took down some accounts, Russian disinformation campaigns related to Ukraine, I think just last week. All of you have noted that it's much more difficult to discern between foreign and domestic, right? And this is something you're seeing in the United States, something we're seeing in Western Europe, we're seeing this everywhere. So the question is, how do you still try to detect and attribute from a civil society perspective when you don't have access to the API, like Facebook's API, for example? So are we just stuck looking at Twitter primarily? So that's one question. How do you actually still detect and attribute in a way that makes sense? Because most of you have been focusing on the kind of overt propaganda, right, from known Russian media outlets. But what about that subversive element? How do you start to think about that, given that it seems like they are evolving their tactics over time to make it more difficult to detect?
I'd be happy to. I mean, about that differentiating between foreign and domestic, I think this is actually part of the reason why, for example, StopFake is doing their job, and why we were doing the kind of job in Brussels with East Stratcom. You try to catalogize all the disinformation messages that you see, and you can say this is the message that I have seen last year on Russian state TV. So the fact that suddenly it's used by a domestic actor, it actually doesn't mean that it stopped being Russian disinformation. It originated somewhere. So we have this problem, obviously, for example, in Czech Republic, where the Czech president very frequently repeats speaking points of the Russian government. But the fact that he repeats speaking points of the Russian government doesn't mean that it stopped being a speaking point of the Russian government. It's just used by someone else. If I use your phone, it doesn't mean it stopped being your phone. But yeah, about the evolution, I'm not sure that you would see the strategic objective being evolved very much. The strategic objective is still to discredit the whole post-Maidan development. But yeah, I think this is something you were talking about, the usage of the social media in the campaign, so I'll leave it up to you.
So first of all, when we're talking about detecting, there is always an entry point, whether it's a post on someone's Facebook feed, whether there is an article on the news web page somewhere online, there is always an entry point, and only after that the army of bots and trolls sometimes are used in order to amplify this message and to share it as much as possible. That is why quite often when we're trying to distinguish whether it's indeed a foreign interference, if we aren't talking about the state-owned media or some high-level, high-ranking speakers, it's about going through Infosys and going through the streamlines and just looking who was the entry point, and obviously checking whether it was true or not. So sometimes it takes a lot of scrolling, a lot of checking, because when the very popular message is being very much repeated, there is a lot of references. So sometimes it's just very, very dull work going through what is going on online. In the terms of how tactics have developed over the years, I would say that the biggest problem that we are facing now, that we see less and less of the direct Russian influence. That's something that, for example, a big message which would be repeated, or like the entry point would be Medvedev, or an entry point would be Russia 24. There is more and more of the political agents here within Ukraine, or the entire network of those websites, shady websites with shady finances, with no information whatsoever, who are the owners and editors and journalists, which are simply used as an entry point. So the main difference compared to, for example, year 2014 and 15 and now is that the entry point is within Ukraine. And that is why it's getting very much difficult to say that this is the Russian messaging, because it might look as Ukrainian one. So the only helpful thing right now would be, if we aren't that sure about the entry point, would be the means to spread the message. So the trolls and groups, and in this regard, I think that probably the most effective measure or like the effective instrument that Facebook has given us is the opening of the information who are the administrators of the big groups. Because once again, it is really very much about meddling in the big groups who, for example, have millions of followers. And sometimes this can be a group of growing up strawberries, and from time to time you have political messages, and when you check, the people who are running it are actually from Russia and always have been from Russia.
Yevhen?
Yeah, just very short adding to what Katya just said, that actually it doesn't matter where the messages are coming from, because when we do the monitoring and debunking, we are already responding, so our action is always kind of retroactive to this, and that gives us very little kind of opportunities to be ahead of what they are doing in terms of tackling disinformation. But what StopFake, for example, was doing, we've always been looking where this information, what platform was used to create and disseminate the fake narrative. There we also try to respond. So initially Russian television, for example, was a big platform to disseminate this information here. So we started TV shows to talk the same language with the same audience, to be on the same page with them. Then social media. So if some fake narratives are coming in social media, we use social media as a very first platform where we respond to that, and so on. And that gives us the opportunity to talk the same language with the same audiences, because it's very, very diversified. What Russian disinformation is really great in to be very flexible and to be very opportunistic. So when Ukraine banned Russian TV channels, they immediately started to look for other venues to be present there. When Ukraine sanctioned Russian social media companies here, they immediately started to use another legit instruments available, and it's just a question of weeks, it's not even the question of years or months. They're really very quickly responding, because they're not restrained by anything, by resources, by democratic approaches to this, by moral issues and other things. So they have very kind of open approaches to how creatives and campaign what they're doing. So we need to monitor that even for those things, to detect what they are currently using, to be over there as soon as possible.
That's another lesson from the work of the Atlantic Council on mapping the infrastructure. So hitting and targeting the infrastructure, sometimes it's more important than filtering out the messages, since the infrastructure is quite automated, and then it's easier to map it and destroy it, especially if it's not influencer accounts, which is another problem. We have, do we have another question?
Hello, my name is Olga Vazovska. I'm the head of Civil Network Opora. We observe these elections, and I have two questions. First of all, why you decided to assess this election like a separate electoral circle, not a part of broader electoral circles or broader political processes? Because as for me, Russian Federation is the best myth maker in this world. That's why you had to start assess the interference of Russian Federation into electoral circles, not from the start of 2019, but from 2016, for example, because there are many signs that they changed their strategy about Ukraine and communication about the next political circles in this country, and they started to fail to talk a storytelling about failed state or mistrust to Ukrainian institutions from those days. That's why we had the very good mood in the society for such results of these elections this time. At the same time, you told that Russia didn't support any politicians. I disagree with you because it doesn't true, and I believe that the internal sociological polls and researches for now showed that the next parliamentary election, they will have the second fraction on the parliament with pro-Russian vision, with a great power, and with a very specific change or objectives for the next 5 years in this country. For example, the myth about fascism in Ukraine, they started to cover Ukrainian society with this ideology and stories from 2012. And we have enough facts. And Europe started to believe in this myth from 2013, late 13. That's why we should assess these elections, not separated from the next parliamentary and not from January 2019 as well.
Yeah, actually the Atlantic Council does disinformation monitoring since probably since the Maidan revolution when it comes to Ukraine. So the disinfo.org portal, it's one of the initiatives that sprang from that work. But I think it's a question for Jakub, since he also been monitoring the same development, not with the Atlantic Council, but with the European Commission a long time ago.
And we were partnering with StopFake, who are doing this job also for the past few years. So, I mean, when you do a report on the elections, you simply limit yourself to some time period. I mean, but it doesn't mean that we would ignore all the experience that has been gathered until now.
It's a case study.
And this is a report about the elections, so it's about the elections. I'm sorry. Yeah, frankly, I didn't say that they didn't support any candidate. I just said that this strand of disinformation was not as strong as you would see in other European elections, be it the Austrian, the German, the French, the American elections. This element was not that strong as it was in the other elections. This is the only difference I said.
If I may, to do a quick follow-up to Tatiana Slipachuk about the next electoral campaign, because part of this question was that probably parliamentary elections will be much more important and probably highly likely will be attacked even more than presidential elections just because they're more consequential. Do you agree with it?
Yes, I agree with this for different reasons, as well as I agree with the basic idea which was announced that in fact we must be more precise in understanding the process. What I mean, for example, for CSC, the problem with each issue with disinformation lies in determining whether it is the disinformation on the basics of the electoral process. Because we actually faced two types, the false information about the members of the commissions, of their relations, situations, etc., and namely we also try, according to our resources, to monitor the situation. What why I started with the a little bit critical notion that we were alone actually in this process, in order to understand whether it's something originated on the basis of like just put the mistrust in personality, or whether it is something which is aimed to ruin the basic principles of the elections. And for example, I will say to you, like the message which was originated from the Ukrainians, saying that, for example, SBU controls e-voting. And it was not only the message, it was the legal proceedings, etc., etc. But the simple thing, SBU controls the voting, was then spread in a very serious campaign against the electoral process, because what it means, SBU, Avakov, Poroshenko, Zelensky, then all other myths, all other interpretations which are possible, immediately originated both in Ukraine and in Russia Federation, with different purposes, with different audience, etc. For us it was a real challenge, and finally the Commission decided, and we will probably follow this position in the next campaign. We just decided to be very clear and to be extremely legalistic. When we see such situation, we did a lot of briefings, also with the participation, inviting different persons and saying, please see, that is the law, that is the situation, that is the position, that is the documents, it's me, ask me, I will tell. But what was the most big problem, what, for example, was mentioned by Yevhen, it is different for us to find the audience immediately, because we make the briefing before mass media. Some of them make the direct actual vision. Some of them take some words. And if we have the parliamentary campaign, we need to be heard in local places, and for us it will be a problem, for example, and in this issue we need assistance, otherwise it could be a big falsification of the process from the point of giving the incorrect information, of misuse of the legal rights in the electoral process on the local level.
But, for example, using social media and speaking to the voters directly could be one of those strategies. But also, do I understand you correctly, you also invite more participation from civil society. You said that you felt that there was lack of participation from civil society. Is that correct? Help or assistance provided to you?
Unfortunately, again, it's my personal view that I would be happy to actually to be. To me, that it is a mistake and I misunderstand something, but it seems to me that the majority of the civil society in Ukraine, they consider that their main task is to criticize and to attack the institution, but not to stand near in the challenges and to assist in promotion, the legality, the information, the basics, etc. At the beginning I said that I can mention up to 3 or maybe up to 5 NGOs whose main aim was to safeguard the principles of democracy in the electoral process and to assist also the CSC and the local commissions in the situation when it is necessary. That is a problem with our social society, actually.
Thank you. Can we get another question, please? I saw there was willing. You go.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask Tatiana about the vote count in particular. Do you, and this may be more important for Rada elections, but from a technical perspective, do you feel like this is a worry, or is it somehow possible that a hacker could change the vote count, is my question, when it comes to determining a winner?
And can you name yourself?
My name is Kenneth Gears. I'm with the Atlantic Council.
So if you, when you ask about change from paper to electronic, what do you mean to change the voting process? What do you mean, what to change? What we have? We have the legally reasonable process. It is the voting on the paper, on the basis of paper documents. That is according to legislation. What we have in addition, and only for presidential campaign in a way that it is comprehensive, the analytical electronic system, which allows the community to see the preliminary electronic data before we count on the basis of documents. And if you ask me whether I want to change crucial now from paper documents to electronic, I will say no, we are not prepared. Because even very simple things I'm doing on the basis of this electronic system is under a big doubt because of historical perspective, because of what was said previously by Olga, for many other reasons. And it will compromise the good idea from the very beginning. The second issue, unfortunately, it's good that we are big, but unfortunately, we are quite big and we do not have the same level of communicational support for electronic services everywhere. It's also the question, and I don't want to create any kind of different approaches to different parts of the Ukrainian population.
Another question?
Thank you. First, if I can, just quickly on the point about when do you start. As Jakub said, we went into this with full awareness of what Russia had been up to going back to 2014, not just 2016 in the United States. And the project was launched with the expectation that what happened in the past would be repeated in one form or another in the election that just took place. The question I wanted to ask the panel is something that we didn't cover very much in our report. In fact, didn't really cover it at all, and that is Russian money. To what degree did Russian funding, money play a role, not just in disinformation, and maybe other panels can address this when they come up too, but in terms of trying to either corrupt the process or tip the balance in one direction or another? Thank you.
This is a very important question, and actually answering it, I would follow up with a certain line of criticism which was already raised by the fellow colleague on the panel, is that unfortunately we don't have much of the evidence. We have very strong school of Ukrainian investigative journalists, but they are mostly focusing on Ukrainian internal affairs, checking the assets of politicians, of oligarchs, and all the different political connections. And unfortunately, we haven't seen much of the reports tracking Russian money or tracking shady financing. There have been only a few cases with regards to the Vesti newspaper, and there has also been investigation, but with not that much results into the News One channel, which is very pro-Russian and quite often serves as an entry point for the Russian narratives into Ukrainian public debate. But we don't have that much evidence. Everything that we are basing our assumptions on is our experience, is our assumption, and so on and so forth. And for example, there was incredibly good investigative report on Marine Le Pen's party in France, how it was financed via the Czech banks, via different proxies in Europe and straight from Russia. And this is something that gives an incredible power not only for the experts community, but also for the law enforcement agencies, and increases the trustworthiness of the entire battle against the Russian influence in European countries and all over the world. Because quite often, honestly, when you go to the panels or when you go to the audience, which is really very much critical about the Russian influence and is welcoming your messages and your reports with, you're being paranoid about Russia. When you have this kind of evidence, when you have this kind of report, this gives incredible strength to all the messages that you have. That is why I would say that this is a great request to Ukrainian civil society, first of all, to the law enforcement agencies as well. But, we will have SBU chief on the next panel, so maybe this is kind of the request that civil society can pose. But there is definitely a lack, because we know that there is this influence, that Russian shady financing is in a great deal behind many disinformation campaigns and many politicians in Ukraine, first of all, who are being the entry point for the anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian narratives. But we need an evidence. We are a society and we are the country which can't accuse someone based on the grounds of our assumptions.
Yeah, and it's surprising, since a lot in the region, you see a lot of examples now, more and more investigations done by other independent newsrooms in other countries tracking dirty money, not only from Russia, but other authoritarian regimes like Azerbaijan and Turkey to Europe. And it's surprising always to find out that within Ukraine, it's not being picked up as a topic, although Ukraine is, in all those reports, is featured all the time as one of the
This is really
countries
very painful for me to actually to make this kind of conclusion, but it still seems that for many people in Ukraine, the main enemy sits in Kyiv, not in Moscow. This is still the kind of the perception that has to be changed also within many influential circles, also within the civil society in Ukraine.
Can I just add, maybe if you could too, is foreign funding of candidates and parties illegal in Ukraine? Sorry, I don't have a mic. They probably didn't hear that. You might want to just repeat it.
For that question you actually raised, it is a really important question. I can answer in two aspects. On the one aspect, which is very legal, because I'm a lawyer and I'm a good lawyer, for saying anything on that kind, I need an evidence, as it mentioned, and not only the evidence of journalists, I need a real, legally available evidence, because also we know that such audio-video falsification also is a very good thing. We know how it can be used now, because audio-vision is even more influential than paper document. We know this. And I was asked about this parliamentary campaign, we suppose, I do think that you can add something to my words, that it will be widely used on the local level to fight between local candidates, using not only paper documents, but again, quasi-investigations, video facts, false photographs, etc., etc. It's one issue. Another issue, for this presidential campaign, for the first time, the CAC monitored together with NAZK the financing of the electoral funds. What we really receive, we have questions from the point of these ordinary people who donated quite big amount of money to that or these politicians. It was in media, it was commented by different NGOs, by civil society, etc. But again, it's not the thing we are responsible for. We can see this. We are open, we demonstrated in our open data, which could be used by everybody, including Ukrainian specific organs, to see whether these persons are that or those. For example, I can tell you that in one of the cases, the Central Electoral Commission just received the payment of the necessary advance for presidential candidacy from not directly from the candidate, but from different Ukrainian citizens. This candidate was refused in application to be registered, and then we face the issue, what we shall do with the money. According to the law, we have the right to return this only to the candidate or the party who actually initiated this. In this particular situation, we actually send this money to the budget, and it means then from the electoral process it is clean. From the very civil perspective, it is the question for these physical persons, whether they have the reason to ask return back this money. We faced not only the judicial proceedings, we faced a lot of investigations, etc., etc. But as far as I know, nothing was initiated in order to establish where these very ordinary people without consistent work have this amount of money to pay for this purely pro-Russian candidate. That is the question actually you raise, and it is still without the concrete question in Ukraine, I do think.
Is it illegal to take foreign money
Yeah.
for a candidate? So it is illegal to take foreign money for a candidate or a party?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kateryna,
Thank
a
you.
quick follow-up. From the point of view of law, for example, as we've seen some examples, online campaigns, paid political campaigns online on Facebook, on other social media platforms, do you have, are you equipped legally well enough to put roadblocks if that, for example, campaign is financed from abroad? Because now Facebook exposed this information. So if it's this campaign paid from abroad, there is a disclaimer saying that it was paid from Russia or whatever. Do you equipped legally well enough to fight such disinformation
It's a
tactics?
painful question, actually, you're asking me about. We are not equipped legally in a sufficient way for many different things, including this one.
So you need new parliament to work on it?
Yeah, we do not have the necessary legal instruments and possibilities to react. What we did before this campaign, we met with the Facebook representatives. We are very happy to agree with them to receive us in a very quick way these bluebirds in order to establish that we are official website, and for my personal page in the Facebook, the chair of the commission.
Verification, yes.
And we also discuss all this issue. We explain what can be the tips, the flags for them to understand whether this is the disinformation campaign or not. We establish the contact if necessary for us to be questioned with regard to different issues, and that dot. Personally, we do not have any possibilities. For example, according to the law, the candidates for the second round of the elections, they are not allowed to proceed with their agitation till we make this final counting and saying these two are. But this discussion on whether the debate should be on the stadium or somewhere started immediately. Much a week simply before we actually announced the results, despite we worked almost for 14 hours per day at that period of time. But we did not have any opportunities except saying and applying for their just understanding that if you are going to be a president, you need to follow the law. Please keep calm, wait, and then only start.
And you don't have any laws to
I do not
penalize
have
them.
any other tools except trying to explain to them that
To
it's
appeal to
not.
their conscience.
Yeah, you're right.
And a quick follow-up to Galina about the money and media, because I know there is a big problem for Ukraine, transparency of media funding.
Yes, I would like to say that we think that we have Russian money in Ukrainian media. We have no evidences, yes. And that's why we are discussing, and our NGO is advocating for draft law for funding transparency of media, because we have the law of transparency of ownership, but not of funding. And I believe that we should take some skills from banking sector in Ukraine, because national bank in Ukraine is quite more successful than media regulator in tracking funding transparency.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that according to documents in Ukraine, I think it's Station 112 is owned by a German citizen of moderate financial means. No longer.
If I'm not mistaken, because they had a couple of rounds of changing the ownership. At the moment, the owner is Taras Kazak, yes, who is friend and companion of Viktor Medvedchuk.
But no, I mean, like as a follow-up to, even if you establish the law that opens up the not only ownership but also funding, in some cases the funding still legally comes from Ukrainians or Ukrainian funds.
Yes, but this person who funds TV channel is not cheap business, and it's not profitable. This person at least should show that he gains this money from other businesses legally.
Okay, do we have questions? Yep.
Yes, I would like to make, my name is Mariana Dracho, I am from RFRL Ukrainian service, and if I may, a short comment, because I represent the civil society and watchdogs, and there was a question about Russian money and whether Ukrainian investigative journalists are doing enough, and I would like to pinpoint that it was our journalist who uncovered this shadow German businessman who previously owned 112th channel in Ukraine, and also also a year ago we tracked the money that belonged to the wife of Viktor Medvedchuk, the closest ally of Russian president in Ukraine. We uncovered that Oksana Marchenko has the control of Russian oil and gas field, and this is something about the work of Ukrainian investigative journalists. My question to you would be to your plans for the parliamentary elections. Many of you said that the Russian influence might be stronger, that it might be harder to detect. So my question is whether the Ukrainian election task force is going to continue its activity, and what are you going to change before the parliamentary elections in Ukraine?
Jakub? I think maybe John or David.
I think we're still in the process of looking at this. We recognize the importance of maintaining vigilance when it comes to the route of elections, possibly even increasing it. It'll be a more complicated process to monitor, given the number of candidates that will be involved and the kind of election that it is. And that also indicates that there could be more opportunities and openings for outside interference to meddle in that process. The parliamentary election is as important, if not more important, than the presidential election, given the political structure in this country, as you know. But there'll be more news on that hopefully soon. But I think all the partners involved recognize that whether this project continues or not, this country needs to remain vigilant. Civil society needs to partner with government organizations to be on guard, because any sense of complacency that might have emerged from the presidential election will be completely unfounded.
I can follow up on the main lessons that has to be taken into account when it comes to parliamentary elections. I think it will be much bigger of a mess when it comes to parliamentary elections, because, to be honest, I think within the expert community where we're prepared to bigger efforts and much stronger efforts coming from Russia, and they were acting more or less calm. I personally was preparing myself for the worst, and I think that they went considerably mildly. With the parliamentary elections, the very problem lies in the very system. We have a mixed system when we will have MPs coming both from party lists and from the constituencies. And this is the major problem, because even looking at the composition of the current members of the Verkhovna Rada, most of the shady people or people with questionable background or with very, very questionable views, they were coming not from party lists, the open ones, but they were coming from the majoritarian constituencies. It means that we should direct a lot of attention, first of all, into the local television, into the local networks, because also based on the fundings and on the analysis of the presidential campaign of the main candidates, they were differentiating their messaging up to the region, meaning that for one region, for one audiences, they were saying one things, and then for another region, there was a different kind of messaging, meaning that when it comes to the parliamentary elections, there will be even more differentiation. So there will be need to focus not only on the central level, because mostly on the central level, on the level of the TV stations and radio stations and biggest newspapers and magazines, this will be a battle of parties. And on the local level, this will be the battle of individuals. And from even our StopFake experience of dealing with journalists in the regions and conducting many trainings for them, this is quite a weakness. That there is still much to be done on the local level, because I would say that the journalists and the expert community in Kyiv is quite trained, is quite equipped with different instruments and with the understanding, but there is a definite need to look more and to give more attention to the regions in Ukraine as well.
And since Atlantic Council does involved in a lot of disinformation initiatives all around the world, one probably main lesson that infrastructure to maintain it 24/7 is extremely expensive. And it's not up just to the civil society or non-governmental organizations to do that. It's just too expensive to do that on a constant level. So there must be cross agent cooperation there. Yevhen, you wanted to add something?
I would just say that we would continue monitoring, and from our point of view, parliamentary elections would be much more enforced by Russian disinformation for one very simple reason, because we already see the pitching of Ukrainian candidates trying to get Russians' attention and Russian money, what we've been already talking. And the only way to do that is through subscribing to Russian narratives again. So if they are using already them very actively and repeating them and using them in their electoral and media campaigns, they are basically flagging that we are open to cooperation. And from Russian point of view, and I was saying that Russia was not supporting only one candidate, so I meant that that was not the binary, traditional binary. We have one pro-Russian candidate and one pro-Western candidate. So they are kind of looking at who might fit into kind of their more general narrative, not on a personal level, but who can serve their interest in that or another way, purposely or non-purposely, intentionally or not knowingly about that. And they're already kind of searching for those types of candidates and parties, and that would be the ground why they would be providing financial support for them. So again, the lesson number one, we should look for those narratives, and we should look for those people, groups, parties who would subscribe to those narratives and would be disseminating them more actively than usually.
Do we have any more questions? Or last question? Okay. Last question? Anyone? Oh, okay. We have one last question.
Hi, I'm Aaro Ylitalo from the Finnish Embassy. I would still go back to the role of official Russia, maybe a little bit what Olga Ivasovska said before. What's your interpretation on the purpose of Yuri Boyko's and Viktor Medvedchuk's trip to Moscow just before the first round of the elections? And do you have any idea who might have initiated the trip? Thank you.
Wow. Anyone to take?
I can't say I have any idea who initiated it. No, no.
Maybe next time.
I mean, yeah, it is fairly obvious that if there was one candidate that the Kremlin supported, it was this one. My remark was merely about the proportion of the messaging. If you look at the monitoring we were doing constantly during the whole project, you would see that 95% of the messaging was truly about denigrating Ukraine as a country and delegitimizing the process as such, and it wasn't really focused that much on the specific candidates.
And it says also, if I'm not mistaken, in the report, when it comes to foreign interference, just one candidate was visually backed by visit to Moscow, by meeting high Russian officials. So in the report, it's featured as a part of this interference as well, but it was just one candidate.
I would also add that for many candidates for whom it was obvious from the very beginning that they have no chances to win the presidency, most of the people or parties or political groups backing them, they were playing in advance for the parliament elections to get the recognition, to get the audiences. And first of all, when we're talking about Boyko and Vilko, largely the space which is represented as a pro-Russian one, they are doing not that bad in the rankings when it comes to the parliamentary elections. If I'm not mistaken, currently they would have the second or the third place when it comes to the parliamentary elections. And this is simply the kind of the long-ranging game. Okay, we don't have a shot at the presidency, but we have a lot of attention, which will be very influential for us when it comes to the parliamentary elections. But very different thing that I would like to mention, not everything that Russian state media is doing is against Ukrainians. Sometimes it's also for the purpose of the domestic Russian audience. If you follow the messaging against Ukrainian authorities in general, not only Poroshenko, but the government and the parliament, probably the main narrative against Poroshenko would be that the only reason why the Russian and Ukrainian relations are as bad as never before is because of Poroshenko and his team and his allies. So there was, in a way, the messaging that if we change Poroshenko, if we change his people, the relations between Ukraine and Russia will go back to normal. And we wouldn't see major Ukrainian politicians traveling that much to Russia or meeting with Russian officials in front of the cameras and actually delivering this message. I think it was also playing very much into this narrative for the Russian population that change is coming. You see, there are Ukrainian politicians who are ready to negotiate with Russia, who are ready to return to the normal state of relations, and the change is forthcoming because the biggest enemy and the only problem in the relations is actually Poroshenko, Parubi, Groisman, and so on and so forth, those post-Maidan people. So I think this is something that served for two audiences, and definitely I would say that based on the latest statements and based on the reaction of Russian media, state media, to that, Zelensky is quite a disappointment for them, because they had to change narrative almost in 2 or 3 days after his reactions to the Putin's initiative to give passports away and to the embargo of oil to Ukraine. And those are very hard statements, very much in line of continuation of Poroshenko's and his administration position towards Russia. And from one day to another, Russian media has actually started criticizing them and changing their perspective on president-elect.
And also scare Russians, since, you know, democracy is such a mess. Look at this. You don't want to do this. Since David is a Boston. Last questions.
Just one last question. A common theme in Russian disinformation has been that Ukraine is run by fascists and neo-Nazis. In light of the outcome of the election and the prime minister and the president-elect, do you expect that line of disinformation is going to change?
Actually, we're expecting that to persist, but from another dimension. So definitely they would be looking for any instances of criticism of them as examples of anti-Semitism and growing anti-Semitism as a reaction to them coming to power. But you're absolutely right that you actually don't need the things on the ground to press any false narratives. You can just invent them. And again, Russia is really very kind of flexible in doing that. Just to give you one very short example, how they've been commenting the results of the second round. So, the results of the first round, when they learned that actually Poroshenko and Zelensky are coming to the second round. So they said that, yeah, actually, this was on Russia 24. They said, yeah, we've always been supporting Poroshenko. And I was like, interesting. How that was, because we've been criticizing him, and we know that in Ukraine, if someone in Russia is criticizing someone, so we support him to get elected, you know. So this is kind of to give you an example of this very weird logic, and the reason for that, they actually didn't expect the outcome to be like that. So very last moment, Russia was sitting on the fence because they still believed that Poroshenko would use what they call administrative sources and leverage to win election, whatever, you know. And that was the reason why they provided the live broadcast of Ukrainian debate, because they expected disruptions, some other examples to demonstrate that, look, when you give people the right to perform democratically, you would always have bad outcomes. And then nothing wrong happened, and they were actually perplexed with that.
Well, surprises do not exist only in dictatorships, right? But yeah, we talked in the beginning that the level of interference wasn't as bad as we expected, yet we spent 2 hours unpacking so much. I want to thank the panel. Thank you for donating your time and your expertise. I want to thank the audience for your questions and also coming here and participating. If you like it, you can give a round of applause to the panel. If I'm not mistaken, we're going to have a bit of a break, and after that, lunch. Yeah, it's better. And after that, we're going to come back for another panel. Thank you so much.